Hey everybody, welcome back to Spartan Theology. I've been doing these live streams about every day during the week at lunchtime, and today we got a special guest. We got Dr. Garte joining us today just to have a pretty relaxed conversation. Just kind of I really like what he's doing over on his YouTube channel, and he just put out a book, so we'll talk a little bit about that. But yeah, if you could just introduce yourself, and we'll get the conversation started.
Sure. My name is Cy Gart. I'm a retired biochemist. I was a research scientist in both academia and later at NIH. And I was raised in an atheist family and came to Christianity much later in life than most people.
Yeah.
The book, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so actually, like when you start talking about that, one thing, if you want to talk about your book for sure, I noticed that in a few of your other conversations, you said that one of the first things that sort of led you down the path away from atheism to theism was just this like realization that materialism or naturalism just is not
Right.
how the world really is. If you could kind of expand on that a little bit, I'd love to talk about that.
Yeah, that I mean, I guess I should preface this by saying that uh, my form of atheism was not what some people call the weak or the mild kind of atheism, which is you just don't believe. I strongly believed that there was no God and that materialism was sufficient to explain everything we needed to explain or understand. And that belief was sort of crushed by my scientific education, both in physics and later in biology and biochemistry. And I began to see the refutations in natural sciences that exist against refuting materialism as a sufficient worldview. And there are so many things that are, that just don't work with materialism, including science itself. Modern physics is not materialistic in the sense that it had been up until the beginning of the 20th century. And quantum mechanics, relativity, to some extent, particle physics as it relates to those, all have put large dents in the idea of materialism as a sufficient worldview. So when I began reading that in my 20s or 30s, I was reading about physics and I was also studying biochemistry at the graduate level. I also began learning things about life that I found kind of pointed to something beyond materialism, something I didn't know what it was, but I began thinking that maybe this whole thing about spirituality, which I had heard about, might have something to it. And I started looking into that. But I didn't actually become a theist for quite a while. I was an agnostic during most of my early adulthood and just didn't know. And I was curious as to what reality was really all about. And I looked into a few things like Buddhism and New Age stuff, which was popular at the time. And eventually, I guess it was in my 40s, I started considering Christianity as a possibility, although I was pretty reluctant to do so. And there's a lot of detail of this in my book. I can show it. I have a copy right
Yeah,
here.
and I put a link to the book in the
Okay, good.
Nice.
So a lot of this, including the details of the scientific arguments that convinced me are in the first part of the book. But even though I went to a church finally, I enjoyed the service much more than I thought I would, and I started even looking into the Bible, which I'd never read. And I found the Gospels incredibly inspiring, and they seemed real to me, Book of Acts, and then eventually the rest of the New Testament.
Yeah, that's awesome. The main thing, like when I heard about your story, is just like we hear this idea all the time from like atheists and whatnot that the more we learn about science, like the farther we get from faith. And I just think your story is just a really cool example of how that's not necessarily the case at all.
It's actually the opposite, and I think the way it works is there's a sort of a strange curve that goes on, and Heisenberg has mentioned this. It's one of the quotes I love. When you first start drinking from the cup of science, you lose your faith, but when you get to the bottom, there's God.
That's
And
cool. I've never heard that. Yeah.
yeah, I didn't. It's not exactly the way I put it,
Hmm.
but it. And other people have said that too. Actually, Pasteur said something very similar. Um, so that happened to me, and I think that happens to a lot of atheists, especially the ones who grew up in a very fundamentalist young Earth creation type of Christianity, where they rebelled against so many parts of that, the distortion of science, which is often proclaimed, and not just that, but some of the theology that is they find very restricting, etc. And then they start learning science, and they say, well, that the Bible doesn't say that, and this is opposite to the Bible, and they get fascinated with science, which is fascinating, and so they decide, well, okay, I prefer science to this superstition stuff that I've been learning as a kid, and they leave. Now, I
Hmm.
never
And that,
had that phase, so I
yeah.
never experienced that.
Okay, yeah, that's kind of like what I try and focus on a little bit on my channel too. Is like not necessarily just like refuting young Earth creationism, but just like refuting the idea that that's the only interpretation and that science and faith are at odds with each other. And that's why I
Right, right.
appreciate
So
what you're
yeah,
doing. Yeah.
it's interesting that when you talk, I do a lot of talking to atheists and some talking with young Earth creationists, a few debates and stuff, and they're kind of in agreement on everything. They both agree totally on the correct interpretation of the Bible, which is what they call literal. It's not really literal. It's their version of literal.
Hmm.
But they both them and the young Earth creationists and atheists insist that you know there was a snake who talked, and if you don't believe that, and it's too bad, because I don't dispute that the Bible is the Word of God and is inspired by God, and in some ways could be considered inerrant. But you know, the idea that you just read it and in English and you're now understanding everything that God said and God is kind of silly. I mean, why should it why should it be that simple? It should be
Yeah,
difficult.
totally agree. Do you
Right?
basically hold to like a John Walton's view? I was kind of
In
assuming.
many things, yes, I
Yeah.
really respect John Walton. I've heard him speak several times, and of course read his books. And I think he's got a great way of interpreting the Bible. I also love to read N.T. Wright, and when it comes to the New Testament, and that there's hard theological work. I'm not a theologian, and I've never studied theology, but I know enough to know that I don't know very much.
Hmm.
And it's kind of like science. I mean, you can call yourself a scientist because you've read a lot of articles on YouTube and think that you understand it, but actually that really doesn't work. And it's funny because whenever I read an article online, within three sentences, I know whether the person is really a scientist or not. It's just you got to be trained. I mean, it's unfortunate, but that's life. That's reality.
Yeah,
And
that's kind of where I'm at. Like, I haven't. So I got my degree in engineering, but it's just a bachelor's degree. I don't have any like physics, like quantum physics or anything. So when people start talking about these things, I just know I really can't critique their argument too much. I love to listen to it, but
well, I'm in the same position with quantum
hmm.
physics. I mean, I know a little. I'm probably exactly where you are, but the little bit that I know, I think I understand. Although I don't, I know that I don't understand it, which is
Hmm.
which is important. Biology, I know a lot more. I mean, that's where my PhD is, and I've also worked in several biological fields for about 35 years. So I know that pretty well. And what's interesting is that there's nothing easy in science. There's nothing that just, that's obvious. Usually when you say that, you're wrong. because the natural world is incredibly complex. The natural world is very difficult to understand, and we struggle. Scientists are struggling to make sense of it all the time. And why should the Bible be any different? Why should the Word of God be any simpler than the works of God?
Sure,
I mean,
because like
that's
you hear Kent Hovind say things like, "Oh, if I gave this to a 5-year-old or whatever, they would know exactly what it says. So why are we even
yeah,
debating?"
yeah. And you get a 5-year-old interpretation, which
Hmm.
is amusing, but probably not accurate. I've had a few 5-year-olds, and yeah, it's fun to listen to them, but they're usually wrong.
Yeah,
Very cute, but wrong. So yeah, Kent Hovind is a good example, and I've debated him, and
yeah. I listened to that.
he says it says right here.
Hmm.
Okay, we're not reading it. We're not reading a recipe book or an auto repair manual where you really have to follow the instructions as it's written. That's not what the Bible is. It's obviously not that. Just look at it, just read it, and you can tell right away. Wait a minute, this is a little complicated here.
Yeah, basically
Yeah,
something
I need
I've
some
been
help.
yeah, something I've been thinking about more and more the more I hear like these younger creationist arguments. I really do believe that if you take to like their logical conclusion the way they interpret the Bible, it kind of just I don't see how they get away from like a flat earth or like all these things. It just seems
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've looked at answers in Genesis, and I've looked up stuff that, like, okay, so Adam and Eve were the only two people, and they had a bunch of kids, and so the kids all married each other.
mhm.
So that means what? Incest was okay, and then I look up the answer, and they come up with an answer. Lots of reasons why incest was okay, both morally and biologically. And it reading their answers to some of these questions, because literally, if you read Genesis, literal interpretation is not interpretation. I mean, if you actually read it literally, it never says the Earth is 6,000 years old. That's obviously a calculation that came from somebody in the 16th century who decided who added up the genealogies and
Yeah, Bishop
the
Usher I
number.
think is like one of the
But
first
that's not
people.
biblical. You're right. So that's not. So why why are we saying? And you can come up with any answer ad hoc to anything. Like the speed of light was different in ancient. I mean, all kinds of things, and that's fine if you want to do that. But that doesn't mean you're using a literal interpretation. That doesn't mean it says it right here, so that's right,
Yeah, it definitely
because
doesn't mention
it
the speed of
doesn't say
light
it right.
changing. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So so that's my view. But the interesting thing about all of that, and frankly, my feeling about young Earth creationists is if you agree with me that Jesus Christ was born, died, and resurrected, and he is our hope and salvation, we're both Christians. Whether the earth is 6,000 years old or 14 billion years old, that's not a salvation issue. And Kent Hovind agrees with me on that. He said that, and there's a couple who don't agree, but we'll forget them for now. But most young Earth creationists, if that's what they really want to believe, and they're not involved in biological research where such a belief would be harmful, fine. It doesn't bother me. I would rather they would change their views, because I think it's not helping the cause of Christianity. I think it's driving a lot of people away from the church, and it's silly. It's no need to do that. I mean, by accepting an evolutionary creation or even an ID, intelligent design point of view, or reasons to believe as a model, these are all old Earth creationist ideas with different views on evolution. You're not giving up anything of your Christian faith. I mean, there's absolutely nothing given up. And the arguments I hear that Romans relies on non-evolution is just nonsense. It's easily
Yeah.
refuted. by many
Yeah,
people.
I did a video. I did some research about that as far as like death before the fall, and I just don't think
Right,
that's even at all covered in Romans.
right. I agree. So that, on the other hand, what's very interesting to me is the use of that same point of view, and you mentioned this at the beginning, by militant atheists who are basically, I mean, maybe more than half of the very strident comments that I get on Twitter, and I do get a lot, are straw men because they're saying things that they're arguing against beliefs I don't hold.
Hmm.
So it's hard to convince. I'll get people arguing that evolution is real, and all I can say is, okay,
Of
I
course.
agree. I always have.
Did you? I was gonna wanted to say. I'm assuming the answer is no, but like, was it ever when you became a Christian? Did you look into possibly like thinking that evolution, like you may be wrong on it, or your belief? It's just like it's just too obvious.
No, I never.
Yeah.
I mean, I was worried when I mean, the first few months after I became a Christian, which happened, it's in the book, and you
Hmm.
probably know it. It happened very suddenly one day, and I realized, okay, that's it. I'm a Christian. And after that, I was worried, and I didn't really talk about it. I didn't tell anybody because I was worried that I would have to lose my scientific worldview. I really knew very little about other scientists who were Christians, and I hadn't read any books. I'd heard of Francis Collins because I knew him as a scientist. I didn't even know he was a Christian
Okay.
and I found out he was a Christian in a surprising way. But and then I read The Language of God, and then I began meeting many, many, many scientists who were Christians. I joined some organizations and the
Okay.
American Scientific Affiliation and things like that. So, uh, but at first I was concerned, and I was very relieved that I did not have to, deny evolution to be able to
Hmm.
walk into a church.
I think I've heard you on some other conversations, and I could be wrong, but like, so you believe obviously totally in evolution, but as far as like abiogenesis, you is that like kind of where you're not really on board with a lot of some of the other people? I mean, I don't know, I don't know like too much about the topic. I basically know that's like where like theistic evolution and like naturalistic evolution kind
Right.
of diverge.
Yeah. So we know the science of evolution from the time of affectionately call Luca,
Yeah, I was about to say Luca, or I'm familiar with that.
last
Yeah.
universal common ancestor. Uh,
Hmm.
yeah, Luca. Um, we know what happened after that. We don't know anything before that. There's lots of theories. There are some good ideas like RNA world and chemical evolution and things like that, but we don't really. It's all speculative, and you probably know James Tour, or you've heard of James Tour. He's a chemist who is a Christian, and he has some very strong arguments about why abiogenesis is so difficult. And I believe, very strong arguments from the biochemical. He's from the chemical viewpoint. Mine starts with the possibility of a cell, and then how do you end up getting what all the characteristics of life, and huge problems there as well. Now, does that mean that either of us consider that to be proof that God created life? No, it's not. But it does suggest that the origin of life is a real mystery, and you know, I believe, as a matter of faith, that life is a creation of God. But that is not a scientific view, and I'm actually interested in working on it scientifically. I actually have a paper that I recently submitted.
Okay, okay, yeah, because it kind of relates to, I've been seeing a lot of stuff on Twitter. I know you've been involved in some of these where people bring up this whole idea, like with the COVID-19 thing, like when and if the doctors find a vaccine, all us Christians are gonna say like, thank God that this vaccine came about, and they're gonna be like, what are you talking about? Like this was science, and how there's this like
Yeah.
dichotomy that just isn't in reality is not there.
Right.
We like God is responsible for science, God is
Right.
responsible. So like if
Yeah.
even if we found like a naturalistic explanation for, like, say abiogenesis was true, it
Right. I
wouldn't
agree.
say that God didn't have his hand in it or whatever. I mean,
Absolutely. And I believe the same for evolution, frankly. I mean, you can quote explain evolution through mutation and natural selection. But what a beautiful mechanism that is. And biochemically, it's an incredibly complex mechanism that doesn't get much attention. And where did that all come from? You know,
mhm.
you know, just think. I mean, it's hard to explain this. One of the reasons I started my YouTube channel was a lot of people just don't know the complex details of DNA and protein synthesis and all of that. And I thought it would be good to try to, explain it to laymen. It's hard to do, but I've been
Mhm.
trying. And uh, I don't know. Do you have the link to that channel? It's called Faithful
Yeah,
Science.
I didn't put that in there. Yeah, I've subscribed.
Yeah.
I actually saw your video on like the social distancing and like
Right.
the math
Right.
and like kind of just how that works, and that really like made me kind of get a little more serious. I was working from home at the time, and I was almost feeling like you hear all these people almost making me feel like it's not really necessary or something, and then I
Right.
started seeing more and more, and I saw that one. I was like, okay, now I'm like really thinking about how I'm doing this for other people and not necessarily myself.
Right. Right. Yeah, I made that video. It's nothing to do with God and science, but I figured, well, I have a channel and I know some
Hmm.
stuff, so let me make a video. And
Yeah.
it's gotten a lot of views, so maybe it has had some positive impact. Um,
Yeah.
so, but yeah, that was a little bit of a side project. My main purpose in Faithful Science is to talk about this whole issue of science and faith. And most of the videos that I've done so far are not scientific. They're related to science and faith. But I
Hmm.
have three so far on DNA and genes and mutations, and that's just science stuff. And the purpose of that, and I'll probably do a couple more on proteins. The purpose of that is so I can make the arguments to people that you know the science of life is, you can't dismiss it as science and not theology, because the science of life is so incredibly beautiful and complex. You have to wonder where it came from. And I that's my own
Yeah.
philosophical theological view, and it's hard to explain that unless people really have an understanding of how it all works.
Yeah, that's basically where I come in. Like the teleological, like the fine tuning argument is kind of what really hits home for me. And then I hear like atheists bring up like the puddle analogy, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and I just like,
That's
it's
just
like,
wrong.
yeah, it's almost like hard to respond to sometimes because it sounds good like in the moment, but it's just you just know that's like not the case because it's like not the case. I guess the way I think about it, and maybe I could be wrong, but like in the puddle analogy, like the puddle could be any shape and it doesn't matter. But
Right.
the whole thing that we're saying is that if there was any other shape, there would be not that it would just life would just be different, that it just wouldn't be there at
Yeah.
all.
The better analogy would be to say, okay, you're walking around and you don't just see a puddle, you see a puddle that's in the shape of a complete shape of Disney World with all the rides and everything
Hmm.
else.
Yeah.
And you
Okay.
have to
Yeah.
think, oh wow, how did that? And only that shape allows Disney World to exist. So, what are the odds that you're going to get that size puddle and that
Hmm.
shape of puddle? It's not just any old puddle. And what you just said is right. Any old universe wouldn't work.
Yeah, and see like math figure right here saying like life as we know it. And I basically like the argument is not really that like there could be. I mean, I guess life could be like a little different. You know, that like some people argue about silicon-based life
Yeah.
or whatnot, but I don't. I mean, I think I heard you on Sentinel Apologetics where you don't think that could even really be the case.
Well, it's if we're going to talk scientifically, which I love to do, we have to use science. And I'm not as much of a chemist as James Tour, but I did get my bachelor's degree in chemistry, and
Okay.
I got my PhD in biochemistry. So I know a little bit about chemistry. No, silicon doesn't work. You got to have carbon. You can make some compounds with silicon, but basically you need a atom which can make 4 covalent bonds fairly easily if you're going to have any kind of complex chemicals. Do you need complex chemicals for life? Yes, unless it's some kind of life that has nothing to do with chemistry, and that would be some kind of spiritual life, or angels maybe, or something ephemeral. Maybe it could be AI, which is not carbon based, but it comes from us who are
Yeah, but
carbon
it
based.
seems like we would need something else to create.
Yeah. So I don't believe that there's going to be any other kind of non-carbon based life ever found anywhere, simply because chemically it doesn't make any sense. Now, if you want to say, oh, well, there could be some stuff we don't know about chemistry, maybe there's another element, maybe silicon in certain cases can do other things. Okay, but you can say anything you want. That's what science fiction is for. And if you want to say that kind of stuff, don't say that you're talking about science. Say that you're talking about speculative fiction, because that's what it is. Could it be true? Yeah, anything could be true. I mean, we never expected to find relativity in quantum mechanics back in the 19th century. So, yeah, it could be true. But as far as we know today, there's no basis to think about other kinds of life, that don't need water, that don't need carbon, that don't need the particular temperature we're at. That's all in the, you might as well say, I mean, that's certainly no reason to dismiss God, because God has a lot more evidence than that kind of thing. So,
Yeah, true. I
it's
mean,
kind of silly. It's kind of silly. Um, so life as we know it is probably life as it is. Sorry to say, but that's my view.
yeah, I actually remember when you were talking. I just recently was like skimming through some other conversations you had, and I
Hmm.
listened to that Sentinel Apologetics. You talked a lot about like extraterrestrial stuff, and I heard you say
With Robert, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
you just basically don't think that they exist.
Well, it's interesting. I had a conversation with Inspiring Philosophy, who's, I guess, one of my favorite apologists. And, we agree on so many things. Michael is one of the smartest guys I know.
Yeah, his channel's awesome.
He's awesome. And we totally disagree on astrobiology. And I don't, someday I would like to have a longer discussion with him on that. But I don't know that. I mean, whenever I say this in public, like at a talk, I always add, when people ask me about that, I say I don't think there are any aliens, and then I always say, based on my prophetic ability, they'll probably land tomorrow. So be careful. But I just don't, because of what I know about the enormous difficulties of abiogenesis. One thing is clear: it's not easy. It's not something that's just going to, show up at every planet that has water and
Mhm.
the right temperature and all the other ingredients. I just don't believe it. And of course, I could be completely wrong. They could be all over the place, flying around. There have been some very good books written about it. I mean, from a scientific point of view, nothing to do. And by the way, my view has nothing to do with Christianity.
Mhm.
I have, uh, I know a very famous Christian astrophysicist, Jennifer Wiseman, who is, she's very famous. She's a great scientist, a very devout Christian, and she is absolutely devoted to the search for life in other places. And she and I have had some discussions about this. She certainly knows a lot more about astronomy than I. I don't know anything, but I know a little more about biology, and I just find it very difficult to imagine this is going to be easy. I would recommend a book called Rare Earth, which is fairly well known, and
Mm-hmm.
it makes the case that there may be other life forms, but they're probably going to be bacteria if we go and find them, and not much more. See, the problem is there were several stages. Yeah, well, let me just say this: life began on Earth very, very early, almost as soon as it could, which is very strange. And we don't know why that is. But then it remained as single cell organisms for about 2.5 to 3 billion years. We've only had multicellular organisms for 500 million years, 500 million years, which sounds like a long time, but
Yeah, just funny sounding.
it's a
Yeah.
small fraction of the age of the
Mm-hmm.
Earth. Okay, just 4.5 billion. So it took a very long, very, very long time, much longer than the origin of life, for those single-celled organisms to, become multicellular organisms. So, it may be that there is some way to form life, fairly easily, but to get to us, to get to large animals with nervous systems, that's that's hard.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, we may find a planet that has some algae or bacteria in it. I don't think there's anybody flying around looking at us.
And about as far as like consciousness goes, I know I've seen some people starting to argue about like consciousness could have arose from evolution, but I'm assuming you don't hold that view.
Well, I don't. I don't see
Yeah,
it. I don't see the evidence for it, and consciousness is so unusual as a biological trait. It's so. I mean, when I say consciousness, I mean
like self introspection, kind of.
human. You're right.
Yeah,
I mean, dogs have consciousness
obviously.
of
Yeah.
some sort. The kind of thing we have, I think, is unusual. And when I first read about image of God, I thought, that's what it means. That's what they're talking about. Now, I don't know if that's true either theologically or scientifically. What's interesting about consciousness is that I did read a lot about it at some point in my life, and I learned almost nothing because nobody knows anything. They don't even know the definition. It cannot be defined. How do you define consciousness? And it's just, there's no real good definition. Everybody knows what it is. We
Yeah,
all
that's what I
have
said. It seems
it.
so obvious. Like, do you know
Yeah.
what consciousness is? If you ask somebody, like, obviously, and then what is it?
Well, it's the same thing with life, interestingly
Hmm.
enough. And
Yeah,
people
I've
ask me, is a virus alive? And I
that's
was,
what I was about to say. I like remember learning about that in like high school or something when we took biology. That like the virus is like right on the edge of whether
right,
it's alive or not. But I hadn't thought about that since like recently, and
right.
find that pretty wild.
Yeah, I mean, so all of these important things are hard to define. Life, consciousness, and if you think about it, it's not that easy to define matter, energy, space, and time either.
Yeah, and something else John Buck brings up here in the chat. I know you've talked about this before too. Is what it
Yeah.
means for DNA to be a code.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I don't know whether you saw this, but I've had a couple of debates about whether DNA is a code.
You posted a video on your channel that I watched where you had like some clips, I think.
Yeah, I did. I posted a
Yeah.
clip, and that was a debate, quote unquote, with another scientist, a biologist named Herman Mays, and he agreed almost immediately that DNA is a code. And then I don't remember what else we talked about, but uh, then I had another debate more recently with an atheist who I don't remember what he was he was interested in philosophy, and I don't remember his argument, but there's no question that DNA is a code. And so now what does that mean? Um, does a code require a coder? Well, that's not a scientific issue. That's a theological issue. And I think, yes, a code requires a coder theologically, and that would be God. Now,
Mhm.
that's not a scientific fact because one could imagine, although no one has come up with a very good theory or a scenario for it, but one could imagine there might be an evolutionary way that a code could develop. And a lot of people have put forward, including some Christians I know, have put forward possible ways that a code could evolve before there was a code. I'm not convinced, and it's part of the problem with abiogenesis. You've got to have a code, you've got to have information. I don't really know how you get there when there's no way to make natural selection work.
Okay. Yeah.
So, that's
Yeah.
my own view.
Yeah. Just the origin of life, like just trying to understand evolution as it is and trying to understand the origin of life. I mean, I'm so far away from making any real conclusions there. I just kind of stay away from that topic a little bit. I mean, I see that's kind of where the disagreement lies, and I know I just don't understand it enough, to draw my own conclusions.
Yeah, and there are quite a few evolutionary creationists, which is, I guess, what I call myself, who don't agree with me, including Mike Jones and a number of actual geneticists and scientists in evolutionary biology who are Christians, who don't agree with me and believe that there is no large barrier to abiogenesis. It's just we just need more data, and they could be right, but we don't have the data, and there are a lot of groups working, and they're trying real hard, and some are making some progress, but it's incremental, and we don't even have a good theory right now.
Yeah, it's kind of refreshing to hear like that point of view as opposed to like a lot of atheists online will be like, "Oh, we're basically like 2 weeks away from understanding abiogenesis." Is sort of the way that I mean, they don't say that word for word, but it's kind of the way they portray it. Like, "Oh, it's just right around the corner. We're gonna
And it's
understand
not.
it."
It is not, and that's one of the things I admire about James Tour. I have not. I don't know him. I haven't met him, but I've seen him talk. And he makes it very clear that this is a huge exaggeration when anyone in the scientific field working on it or anyone else says, "Oh, we're very close." No, we are not. We are not close at all.
Awesome. Yeah, that's kind of what I had to reach. I don't know if you had any other topics you wanted to talk about or something.
Well,
Let's see if there's anything in the chat.
Considering where we are, I would just, although this has nothing to do with the topic, I would say if you still think that it's okay to have a party and go out with your friends, take a look at my video on social distancing. It's on my channel. Don't do it. You're not just putting other people in danger. You're also putting yourself in danger, even if you're, young. This is not a good disease. You don't want to get it. Believe me.
Have you? I know you just had a stream with Trinity Radio.
Yes.
I don't know if it seems like this thing kind of changes every day. There's more information coming out and stuff. I don't know if there's been any like recent things that you've been looking into about this whole COVID-19 thing that you think people should know about. Maybe I'm trying to think.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's a good question. I'm trying to think. What do I know that's new from then? That was, I guess, about a week ago. Yeah, I've done a couple of boy. It's crazy. You're right. The first time I talked about this online was actually on an atheist channel called In Time, which is run by Nick Suter. And at first, that was the first time I said something that this is much worse than you think it is. And I only had a vague idea of that. And that was maybe 3 weeks ago.
Yeah, I mean, I saw a thing on Twitter that said like, "This is we're still in the same month that Pete Buttigieg dropped out of the election," and that's just like blew my mind.
Right? It's crazy. What a month!
Yeah,
and at the beginning of this month, it was like, well, we don't know. It may be like SARS. It won't really come here. Well, the more we find out, most of what we're finding out now is not good. And I don't know. It's we're also finding out we still don't know a lot. Now, there are a couple of promising signs for clinical trials of some possible drugs, which will certainly be helpful. I mean, any drug that does anything will be useful. But at this point in time, it's very, very clear from everything that's happened in China, South Korea, Italy, different states in this country, social distancing works. And one of the worst experiments, you don't want to do human experiments, right? But human experiments have been done. So Kentucky and Tennessee are two states very close to each other, very similar in every respect, except that the governor of Kentucky shut down the state a few days before the governor of Tennessee did. And that difference led to a 5-fold difference in case numbers. A few days.
That's great.
And that's explained in my video why a few days makes a difference. So it's hard for people to grasp this because we don't think about exponential math all the time. And I've used this in other discussions. I mean, it's that famous joke that I heard when I was in junior high school that if I give you a penny every day and I double it every day, I give you a penny on one day, the first day of the month, and I double it every day, how much will I give you at the end of the month? And most people have no clue that the answer is, over $1 billion. So exponential thinking is not normal for us. So when we see, there's only 500 cases in my state, that is very bad news.
I think I live in the Houston area, and we just hit like 900 cases or something like that.
Texas is, many states were slow starters. And of course, something like New York City, which also started a little late, but where the contact is incredible. You see where we are with them. It's out of control.
I see a true counterphobia in the chat, perhaps something we didn't touch on, and maybe we could quickly touch on it. The whole Cambrian explosion idea. And the way I've always understood this was it's kind of misunderstood. It's kind of like a period in time where a lot of organisms went from super soft body where they wouldn't really fossilize to more having shells and just living in different conditions where fossils were more able to be created. So that kind of led to what looks like an explosion, but I could be wrong on that.
No, that's part of the answer. The other answer is first of all, most people maybe they don't know this, but the Cambrian explosion took 10 million years. So when you say explosion, it's a relative term because evolution is very slow, usually. But here's the other point. Evolution does not have a constant rate. And this is something that Stephen Jay Gould emphasized. Evolution can be extremely slow. So take a look at sharks, okay? Or there are all kinds of horseshoe crabs. These are organisms that haven't evolved in tens of millions of years. I don't know, maybe hundreds of millions of years. I don't remember the details. And then you have very rapid evolution. Look at us. Hominids. A million years. We have many species of hominids that have come and gone. We're only 200,000 or 300,000 years old. That's very young. And there are many other examples. So there's no constant rate of evolution. So in other words, it is very possible that you could have explosion like the Cambrian. There have probably been many other explosions. Often they come right after an extinction event because now there's a lot of niches.
That's what I was about to say. It seems like a lot of opportunity for.
There's a lot of opportunity, right? So when the meteor hit and all the dinosaurs were knocked out because they couldn't deal with the cold, what was left was a bunch of rats, basically, and some other mammals. And boy, how long did it take? It took maybe 50 million years to get everything that we see today, every animal that we see today. That's pretty fast. It's not an explosion like the Cambrian, but that's a lot of evolution in a fairly rapid time. So I don't think that the Cambrian explosion is a terribly good argument against evolution. It's an argument against certain theories of evolution. And there are a number of, I mean, Darwin himself postulated, because he knew very little. It's amazing how much he got right. But one of the things he got wrong was that he thought evolution would always proceed at the same very slow rate. It would never speed up. It would never change in its dynamics, and that's not true. We know that that's not true.
Awesome. Well, cool. I think we're basically reaching the end here. If we don't have anything else in the chat, I really appreciate you coming on. This was fun. We'll definitely have to do something like this again if you're free or something. But this was cool. So
Okay.
yeah, if everybody could check out Sai's YouTube channel, I'll link it in the description. I put a link to his book in the description. So like I said, I appreciate everybody coming out. I appreciate Sai, and sign off. Everybody, God bless everybody.
Bye-bye.